Southern Mind, Bobby Ramos, Bottomline.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Leading chapter, you have a quote from Frantz Fanon, who passed away in '61, and as you know, he's an extraordinary Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist and a political philosopher. And he stated, I quote, you have in your book, wherever the Negro goes, he remains a Negro, close quote. Starting off with a hammer right there, Professor. Yeah, no doubt about that one. First of all, some people probably wonder how you have skin in the game. Speak to your dualism.
Well, I am the daughter of an African American woman, and I grew up in New York City. And so I had both the benefit and I guess, you would say the challenges of being exposed to Latino racial attitudes, right? Both the sort of glorification of just how wonderful we were as Latinos, that, we were all mixed and we didn't know black and we didn't know white because, we were just a happy mestizo mulatto race of our own. And so we didn't know anything about racism. That was an American, North American problem. At the very same time that, even the very same people who would say those sort of things would be very quick to use anti-Black slurs and, indulge in anti-Black stereotypes, both against Afro-Latinos and African Americans and anyone else from, the African diaspora.
Okay. Interesting. Page 4, you wrote this, and I quote, that you said Afro-Latins belong to both groups. There are people of African descent in Mexico, Central and South America, and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, and by extension, those of African descent in the United States, all with origins in Latin America and the Caribbean. That opened my eyes. Can you explain that a little bit deeper, please?
Well, most certainly. I mean, usually when I say to people, I'm Afro-Latina, or, I study issues of anti-Blackness, including the anti-Blackness of Latinos against Afro-Latinos, people get a little confused. They immediately sometimes jump to the understanding that I'm only referring to people whose parents were, one person identifying as Latino and another parent identifying as African American, for example, and that mixture makes an Afro-Latino. It does, but that is not sort of like my main focus. My main focus is on those who are Latino of African ancestry directly. And, this is best understood by taking into consideration the ways in which 90% of the African slave trade, Africans forcibly brought into the Americas, were brought to Latin America and the Caribbean sort of wide. So of all languages and all colonial powers, but 90%, only 3.5% were brought to what we now call the United States. This is, according to historical data. And so when you think about sort of the density, right, the intensity of the slave trade within Latin America and the Caribbean, having that as the factual background better helps situate how Blackness is, shall we say, indigenous, right, to Latin America. It's not just, people from Latin America and the Caribbean who then get together with somebody in the United States who is Afro-American, using a 1970s kind of a way of phrasing this. Right? So,
I want to put on my bell bottom.
I mean, I guess, to put it very clearly, to say that there are blackity blacks in Latin America and the Caribbean, who only speak Spanish, who've never seen the United States, so on and so forth.
Gotcha. Now, and I see you have the picture of Roberto Clemente behind you, and I did a sports show for almost 25 years, and I'm a big Clemente fan, and I used to tell people, Clemente, first of all, was a dark-skinned Puerto Rican who happened to be very close with Dr. King, by the way. And he had said that we're all from the same neighborhoods, we eat the same kind of food, we're all black. And he said, I am a black Latino. And that never got much much press at all, but the man said that himself. He understood.
Most definitely. Contrary to what sometimes people like to kind of get very focused on, oh, but aren't there some Latinos who look black but then say they're not black? Or what, the people have complicated relationships with, their identity and what have you, but that also overlooks the ways in which there are plenty of us who have never had any kind of confusion about our blackness, and it's not like a newfound aspect. You can of course look at Roberto Clemente, who was a very proud Afro Puerto Rican from Carolina, a very black area of the island, and you can go even further back if you like, to Arturo Schomburg, in New York City, the Schomburg Center, the research library on Black Studies, is sort of founded from the archives and papers of Afro Puerto Rican from the 1800s, Arturo Schomburg, who is famous for having been sort of incentivized, inspired to collect the papers of people from across, the globe who are of African ancestry, in order to respond to a school teacher in Puerto Rico, where he was raised, who said to him when he asked, as a child in grade school, oh, we've been learning all this interesting stuff about the history of the Europeans, and when are we going to start learning some stuff about Black people and Africans and what have you? And the school teacher responds to him, this is on the island, right? Black people don't have no history, worthy of inquiry. It was said more foully than that, but essentially he says this to him, or the teacher says this to Schomburg, and that sort of inspires him, right, to gather the proof of the intellect and the contributions of people across the African diaspora. That man is a Black Puerto Rican from the 1800s. So it's just another way of saying, Blackness is not new, and Black identity is not new to those from Latin America and the Caribbean.
Let's get this popping, because on the cover, the inside cover of your book, you wrote, and I quote, Latinos can be racist, and that civil rights leaders are seemingly hesitant to air the dirty laundry of the bias that exists within communities of color. Close quote. Please respond to that one.
Well, here's the thing about both the beauty and, as like I say, and the challenge, right, of using terms like people of color in the United States. Right? It is a phrase that is, in its best well-intentioned, usage, is meant to sort of unite us all, gather us all in the common strife, against the ways in which non-whites are treated differently in the United States, assumed to be inferior, etc. Right? But the phrase people of color can also hide a world of sins. And what I mean by that is that within Latinidad, right, within Latino communities, if you call all Latinos, part of the people of color umbrella, some of us, are more colored than others, right? And it matters. It makes a difference in our life circumstances. Sociologists have been sort of tracking this very systematically, and in all the ways in which Blackness matters, sort of in ways most people already understand in the United States. For African Americans, Blackness also makes a difference in the lives of Latinos, so that those who are white identified, or even white appearing but not necessarily identified, doesn't matter if you don't identify as white. If you got the appearance that would more easily let you catch a cab uptown, to put it in a New York City kind of framing, then, right, that means that whether you want it or not, right, your skin color is mediating your experience in the world, right? And so it does it negatively for people who are darker skinned, and it does it for more beneficially for people who are lighter skinned. And so, this is why I say that, Latino civil rights leaders, or like legacy civil rights organizations, have this tendency to not want to get into the messiness of how racial attitudes and anti-Blackness and racial stratification are a part of our people of color umbrella within Latinidad, in ways that, left unattended to, will continue to cause a lot of harm.
Wow. Speak to this. You also add, and I quote, Latinos and African Americans continue to suffer from discrimination at the hands of some Latinos who claim that their racially mixed cultures immunized them from charges of racism. Close quote. Is that where you get the term racial innocence?
Well, I had started using that term racial innocence for my very first book, which is, a couple of decades ago, in which I took, it's called Racial Subordination in Latin America. And there I look at the ways in which just within Latin America, right? Nobody, migrating to the United States, that within Latin America and Spanish-speaking Caribbean, that there is this dynamic, right, of always dismissing any questions about the racial hierarchies that exist within those societies, sort of with the notion, oh well, this just is about class, it's not about race, because we don't have racism. The only real racism is up north in the United States. This idea of there's an innocence with regards to racism, that we are the innocents. Any bad racial attitudes we may have, that must be the influence of the imperialists. It's not indigenous to us in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so when I started to sort of almost like a sequel, you look at those same themes from the racial subordination in Latin America book and see how they manifest with those who are Latino migrants, those who are, the generations years later, right? We're here making it the Latino community, but still very much embedded in sort of Latin American framing, right, of racial attitudes, that this same racial innocence could be tracked as well. And I do that by looking at not only the way in which Latinos talk about this in public discourse, in media, etc. I look at it also in cases of discrimination. When people come to court and they say, I've experienced discrimination in the workplace, in an application for housing, in access to a restaurant or other public accommodation, in school, or all the places in which anti-discrimination law seeks to make the world a better place. In those contexts where someone says, I experience Latino anti-Black bias, Latinos, there's this trend where a number of them will respond, oh no, not me. I can't be racist. I'm Latino, right? As if it were its own form of sort of legal defense that you could make to discrimination, rather than I didn't do that, or this person was excluded, but not because of race. They were excluded because,
It wasn't me, right? You know, you brought something. You talked about that on page 11. Why do you say that? You said that judges and lawyers need, including the rest of society, need to learn that Latinos can be prejudiced towards both Latinos and Afro Americans. Why do judges and lawyers need to know that specifically? Because they seem, like you just touched on a little bit, they don't seem to know, or do they just not care?
Well, I think that in some respects, the very same kind of racial illiteracy that exists, such that people like Afro, Latino, who they don't know what that means. That same racial illiteracy, seeps into the legal context as well, such that legal stakeholders, whether they be judges and lawyers, and then the members of the jury, they don't always understand like the background, right? And so for them, when some Latino comes up with the, oh, I can't be racist, I'm Latino, I got lots of colored people in my family, etc. The lack of literacy, right, about Latino racial attitudes makes it such that there is a susceptibility to buy that garbage, right? To believe it is like, oh, well, I guess it is different. It's not like us in the United States where we think black versus white. Well, hello. If you had some literacy, not casting aspersions, just stating facts. If there had been true literacy by Latino anti-Blackness, or the globality of anti-Blackness, there would be a better understanding that we have black versus white as well. And that this is important because in the legal context, that lack of literacy means that law is not being fully enforced. That means that Latinos are being given an off ramp into any kind of inquiry into issues of anti-Blackness that doesn't exist for anyone else.
You know what's funny? You were talking about it on page 6, where you said, and I quote, Latinos who identify themselves as racially black report greater racial harassment from law enforcement and involvement within the criminal justice system, close quote. That's the flip side of it. You know, some people want to have both sides of the coin.
Most definitely, most definitely. And the way in which Latinos experience segregation also matters depending on their racialized appearance, so that Afro Latinos are not welcome, right, in the same housing markets as our white Latinos, or sort of the light skinned ones who may not have racial identity, but let's just all come white. Right? They get a but let's just kind of cut to the chase. They, regardless of their more fluid identity, etc., all right, but they look white, so let's call them white for now. They have a different experience of the world. I'm not trying to say everybody who looks white has got a better, idealized utopia. I'm just sort of stating the ways in which race has an effect, right, on the ways in which you get access, lack of access, a welcome mat, right, or the closed door sign when you're trying to enter a place.
Right. Folks, listen, you really need to get this book, Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality, by Professor Hernandez. It's a fantastic book. It's a great read. You're learning a lot today, but there's so much more in this book. And by the way, I didn't say nothing, but it would make a great Christmas present also. Professor Hernandez, touch on something that I've noticed quite a bit over the last few years when you wrote, and I quote, most hyenas are the Latinos who join the white power organizations and harm blacks, close quote. Thank you for bringing that up. Speak to that, please.
Well, part of the sort of misunderstanding, that Latinos are somehow not part of U.S. racism, is also a blindness to the ways in which they surface, right, in white supremacist organizations, direct members and leaders. The Proud Boys, who were convicted as being part of the attack on the Capitol and trying to, dismantle democracy when Biden came up to be elected. Who's the head of the Proud Boys? Who's now in jail? Right? Yep. Enrique Tario, right? Yep. Latino, right? And many other Latino members. He wasn't just like a one-off. Right? Then Latinos are also part of those who aspire, right, to white supremacy, even if they're not official members, right? So in Allen, Texas, where you've got this Mauricio Garcia, who is sort of a lone shooter, shall we say, but he goes to a mall outside of Dallas, starts shooting people up, right? What do we find on his social media and all his postings? Pictures of himself proudly showing his Nazi tattoos and what have you, and lots of his rhetoric of anti-Blackness. So, it's not inconsequential, right, that we have Latinos who are part of white supremacy, because you can also track this in law enforcement as well, right? Meaning that Latinos who are part of law enforcement also are part of the anti-Blackness, the policing of, Black bodies in public spaces, and the quick finger on the trigger that is unfortunately part of life, as a Black person within a police state. And so, Latinos are in all those spaces. Their Latinidad doesn't make them less inclined, to engage in those matters. And if anything, the idea that Latinos are somehow different from everyone else means that we can lose sight of the relevance of the examples of their anti-Blackness. I mean, sort of think of it as like, oh, well, it's not quite the same thing, or it's not really relevant, or the invisibility. The law enforcement person is just called white. They're not called a white Latino. You may ask me, why does that matter? Well, it matters because when we don't take note that it's a white Latino, that means that the mythology that Latinos are not part of anti-Blackness is allowed to continue, because we're not sort of like earmarking all the places in which they're they're not exceptions, right, to white supremacy. But if we don't notice them as being Latino, right? So I'll give you two examples. The police officer who stopped Sandra Bland, right, and ultimately leads to her death with the ways in which he's so violent towards her, right, before she is jailed, right, for just having a broken tail light or what have you, Prairie View, Texas, right? That was a white Latino officer. Philando Castile, another person who's murdered, right? This is all before George Floyd. Another white Latino police officer. I mean, and I could go on and on. Right? These are ways in which only identifying the police officer as sort of white means that we don't have a tracking of how Latinos are part of this as well.
And it's sad, but in my 27 years of being a cop, I saw that. When I threatened a lawsuit back in '91 for my city not hiring women and people of color, minorities, and I went through death threats and got shot and all that kind of stuff. But there was the Latino brothers who came, not all of them, but a number of them played it white. One of them even talked to me playing about it, but another one who's now a head supervisor, we're in the locker room. There was nobody around but me and him. And he said, Bobby, I'm European. And I'm like, stop, man. He has I don't want to say his name, but it's a very Latin last name. I said, you're Cape Verdean, just like my black ass. What are you talking? And so there was that sentiment because, and I've talked to a lot of young cops about this. They want to be invited to the Christmas party. They want to be one of the boys. They want to fit in, which realistically, when the stuff hits the fan, they always get thrown out there first. They're throwaways. That's why earlier, and I thought about this when you were talking about earlier about the Latinos who can be head of these white racist organizations. And when you look at that and you would say, why would these deeply hateful white folks put this non-person from their group, put this other in the headline, put them first? And I've always thought, maybe it's because I'm from the streets, but to me, they always do it because they're a throwaway. If the shit hits the fan, cops are going after him first. He's the head of it. I think that's why a lot of these organizations won't always put their own as the head because they don't want them being taken down. But a lot of these Latin brothers, loosely called brothers, they're throwaways, so they don't care. When the feds come knocking, hey, they don't care. It's him. It's just me.
Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting take. One thing I've thought about and trying to kind of puzzle through, why would a white supremacist organization like let in those who they themselves say are non-white, right? They call all Latinos, regardless of the shades, as non-white. And here's one suspicion that I have, right? To the extent that these white supremacist organizations want to act as if they are just simply one political organization like any other, and that, when they raid the Capitol, that's not about white supremacy. That's about them exercising their First Amendment rights with pistols in their hands, but that's them exercising their First Amendment rights, etc. Meaning, the more they try to act as if this is just part of, normal political discourse, right? It's easier for them to do that if they don't have a Klan member in the hood at the front of the line, right? It's easier to say, oh, this is just about political attitudes when it's a non-white, seemingly Latino, not African American, mind you, right? I mean, they got some lines that they will not cross. Right? And it's sort of kind of
alone. Right.
Yeah, in their own kind of membership materials or whatever you can find online, they have said you are welcome as long as you fully endorse the superiority of whiteness and European civilization, and as long as any of your racial mixture is not part of African American, right? So they're very clear. We'll do with some kind of mixing, not too much though. And as long as you're on board with our game plan, which we are trying to articulate as being sort of just like any other political party perspective. And so, don't regulate us because we're not racist. We just have very strong opinions about particular things.
Well, they definitely believe in if they can't use your comb, don't bring them home. But so, PJ, talk about the severe Latino reaction you got when you wrote that Los Angeles op-ed characterizing the California murders. Speak to that, please.
Well, this was back in 2006, if I recall the date. Right.
Let me put a quote out there. You said Latinos, it was an ethnic cleansing of African Americans from multiracial neighborhoods, close quote. That's what you say.
Right. So basically what that was all about, right? So what led up to me writing this op-ed back in the Los Angeles Times back in about 2006, 2007, was that there had been a whole sort of series, right, of attacks and murders in South Los Angeles, right? Meaning in the spaces that had always been thought of as predominantly Black, Crenshaw, etc., right? There is a migration, right, of Latinos. And with that, there were these mandates from inside, right, the penitentiary from Mexican gang members, right, using the initiation process, if you will, right, of killing Black people, not other gang members. Like, I want to be very clear about this because sometimes this gets dismissed as, well, gang versus gang. What can we do? No. This was, right, Mexican American gangs, other Latino gangs, dictating sort of the rules of engagement out on the streets and mandating that Latino spaces be cleared, ethnically cleansed, right, cleared of African Americans in any form of violence that was necessary. Indeed, the FBI then followed up with all these investigations, and charges of conspiracy were lodged and successfully litigated, such that, we've got it all on record and what have you. So I'm just sort of describing this in the op-ed, and in the op-ed, I'm mostly saying, like, this is not just about gang versus gang, which, seems very obvious to me. If somebody is like, killed as they're just trying to park their car or go to the CVS, that's not, what one thinks of, right, as part of gang versus gang violence, right? In any case. So I thought that was pretty obvious to state. But then I went the next step. I said, and this is not necessarily so unsurprising when you think about the ways in which anti-Blackness is a deep-seated part of Latino cultures. Right? That we don't enter into the United States, and our family members from generations back who've been here for however long are not excluded from passing on, right, these very strong anti-Black sentiments. Right? That then gets sort of put out there into the world, and Latinos were pretty much, some of the most vocal haters, if you will. They didn't like me using the language of ethnic cleansing. It's funny how, these things are happening right there in front of your face, that people get all caught up in what the terminology is. It's like, but, what word do you think better articulates when you target people of a particular group to say that they're not welcome in that space, and you are using violence to remove them from that space? It seems to me ethnic cleansing got fit pretty well. But, be that as it may, the sort of hypocrisy of their opposition, to what they said was just like a word choice that they found problematic, was their resistance, racial innocence, right, sense of to any kind of complicity within U.S. racism. Meaning, this is not really about us. Why are you bringing this up? What's more important, right, are the white Anglo English speaking racists. This is not so important, and it's not really about race. It's about competition for the streets. It's about turf war. It's always about something else, right? It's never has anything to do with racism and anti-Blackness within Latino communities. And what I was trying to articulate is like, No, it can be complicated, but complicated doesn't mean that racism is not involved.
Right. Well, see. Um, you mentioned that when there's any public or scholarly attention is focused on the subject of Latino, African Americans, and race relations, the predominant um, interest in exploring this presumption is that Afro Americans harbor resentment and bias against Latinos. Matter of fact, your quote on page 11, you said that they say that black folks fear, I quote, leapfrogging over them in competition for jobs and resources, close quote. How do you balance that false narrative?
Well, I mean, first I like to just be very clear to name it. Like for instance, sometimes when I do public appearances and chat with community groups about the book, there invariably is some person who will say, often Latino, oh, this is all quite interesting, but and here how it goes. What about the other side? And what they mean by that is here you are talking about all Latinos being anti-black, but what about black people who are anti-Latino? What about the other side? Right? Um, and so the reason why I like to sort of like just lay it out on the table is because the question itself reveals quite a bit. Meaning the question itself reveals, oh, you think that one thing warrants the other? That meaning it's okay to be anti-black if you feel it's in response to anti-Latino. So that's one thing. Like, why should one excuse the other? And why can't we just deal with our own stuff without you trying to like slip away in defensiveness by saying that there are some black people out there who are anti-Latino? So there's that. Then there's also the empirical data, meaning if you want to say that, oh, well, as a group, African Americans are very anti-Latino, well, the ways in which you come up with these notions, right, from an empirical perspective, talking like a sociologist, right, is meaning it's from surveys. Like you do big surveys of lots of people and you ask them questions, and that's how you gather sort of information about like the U.S. attitude about, you fill in the blank. It's based on surveys. Well, surveys show, right, that when African Americans are asked questions about Latinos in particular, immigration in general, etc., that African Americans are some of the more generous, open-minded, right, of respondents as opposed to white Americans. That is to say, even though there's all this noise, right, all these stereotypings that, oh, African Americans are so worried about like economic competition and so on and so forth, and Latinos sort of gaining, traction on them, they're the ones who, when they're surveyed, unlike US white Americans, right, will say, yes, I think that there should be more generous immigration. Yes, I believe that Latinos or migrants should also have access to public benefits, right? All this anti-immigrant rhetoric, you don't see it so strongly within African American communities, unlike the stereotypes about African American communities, meaning that the empirical evidence is contrary, right, to what the stereotypes are. Right? And I think that the stereotypes are just, in my view, another way in which anti-blackness surfaces. It's always this demonization, always this notion of anything negative is coming from blackness. And so you attribute all the negative of U.S. society to them without also looking at other facts. Typically, this just like take one thing: economic competition. People, oh, we have very segregated labor market. I don't like it, but I just speak in truth, right? And in our very segregated labor market, this often means that there are black jobs, Latino jobs, white jobs, etc. That's how it works, unfortunately. And meaning who you call to see if there's a job at that workplace, etc., falls along segregated lines. And so this idea of like who's blocking who is a misunderstanding of the way in which there's often very little, just like in neighborhoods, there's not, you could have churches in multiracial neighborhoods, but there's a white church, black church, Latino church. So this, in the same way you see churches segregated, you see the labor market segregated. So this idea of competition is really, in some respects, not entirely tied to the on the ground facts of how the labor market operates.
As Dr. King said, the most segregated day in this country is Sundays in the churches. That's exactly what Dr. King said. And you know, the whole thing with all these Trump people and stuff. Oh, the immigrants are coming, taking our jobs. The Mexicans are taking our jobs. I ain't never heard of a Mexican brother walking in and robbing somebody. Look, I don't want your money. I want your job. I don't want your money. I want your job. Doesn't happen. Doesn't exist. Stop all the nonsense. But anyway, this is very telling to me, and I have to get this right. And I want to read what you wrote. When it comes to slavery, you said, I quote, racism and black racism in particular is pervasive and historically entrenched fact of life. Latin America and the Caribbean, over 90% of the approximately 10.7 million enslaved Africans who survived the Middle Passage voyage were taken to Latin America and the Caribbean, whereas only 0.36% were taken to the United States. As such, the legacy of slavery in Latin America and the Caribbean is similar to that of the United States. Having lighter skin and European features increases the chances of socioeconomic opportunity, while having darker skin and African features severely limited social mobility. Close quote. Damn. Please speak to that. Damn. Wow.
Well, you know, the short version of that is that all the ways in which we think of racial hierarchy and racial exclusion as following along a pigmentocracy, meaning from light to dark, dark to light, in the United States, that is also part of the reality in Latin America and in the Caribbean. That the legacy, in other words, of slavery and all the anti-Black rhetoric, right, that was utilized to try to normalize slavery as an institution and then carried on through Jim Crow segregation and so on and so forth, that too, right, is very much part of the Latin American and Caribbean context as well.
You know, speaking to that, I remember the great documentary that Dr. Henry Louis Gates did, and I believe it was Haiti and somewhere else, Latin American country, where it's divided. The people are divided by a river based on the color of their skin. Divided by the color of their skin. It's a great documentary. It came out like 12, 13 years ago, but it was fantastic. I should have the name written down somewhere, but it speaks to just that. Page 13, you wrote that quote, the darker a person is in Latin America, the worse their access to opportunity as compared to those with lighter skin in the same educational level and in socioeconomic status, close quote. Tie this in, you have a little bit where you were talking about sociologist Edward Tellis, his investigation, where his team found that researchers found that skin color is essential axis of social stratification, even when one controls the educational level and the socioeconomic status. You also wrote about this in chapter 2, playing and learning in white Latino spaces. Please speak to that, because I think that's very important, Professor.
Well, I mean, I think an example that kind of helps make it real crystal clear for people, you know, in the midst of all the sociology speak, is looking at twins. And when you think about biological twins, you think of them as one, having the same, whatever the genetic blessings or curses of a family, right? They're in the twins together. And when you think about their cultural capital, you know, if it's poor family, rich family, whatever, they got the same things, right? They're twins, they're living in the same family, they got the same parents, etc. They actually are helpful in doing, you know, research, right? Why? Because where you have, as we do in Latin American families, but also African American, right, where there may be biological twins, but one is light and one is dark, you can track. And unfortunately, it happens repeatedly enough that it is a pattern. You can track the ways in which the lighter twin has greater access, right, to socioeconomic mobility than does the darker skinned twin, right? Despite the same biology, despite the same parental sort of standing, right? Besides the same cultural milieu. Now, uh, sociologist Edward Teles, right, documents this in a sort of macro way by looking at how skin color mediates all this access across entire societies in Latin America. A sociologist who looks at it up close and personal, that's what sort of might be familiar to people, is Afro-Puerto Rican Eduardo Bonilla Silva. Eduardo Bonilla Silva looks at the ways in which within a family, even his own family, right, there
Fantastic.
are these ideas of who's in, who's out, what family members are worthy of investment. So, how do you understand this difference between the twins? One way, right, is the outside world reacts to their light versus dark skin, but that's not the only way, because no matter how society structures barriers to access, we all know of the exceptional stories, right? The Obamas or what have you, the Oprahs who managed to fight their way out the box. Right? However, if within your family there is already Jim Crow happening within the family, meaning that the family makes a difference of who's the lighter and who's the darker, and puts whatever their social or economic capital into the lighter one, right? That's another aspect of understanding why time after time there are differences in socioeconomic status between a light-skinned twin and a dark-skinned twin.
Let me this is nothing in your book. Let me bring my experiences. Um, my father was a twin. I mean, exact twin, Cape Verdean. And my father was a strong black man. His twin said he was white. And there are identical twins. And I remember my father, they were both carpenters. They built houses since they were 16. And we were working in Bridgeport, black neighborhood, and I constantly heard my father's brother, my uncle, I hate working around these niggas. I can't stand niggas. And it caused, my father didn't like him saying that in front of me. That was the thing. He knew his twin, but he didn't like, I was maybe 16 at that time, 15 or 16. And there was such a difference between their mentalities, and they were identical twins. I just wanted to put that out there. It can go deep, as you said. It can go deep, and my father's side of the family is just that. A certain percentage of them, there's a lot of us, consider themselves white, consider themselves European. I had first cousins from when I was 12, 13 at family functions, and they would call me and my other cousin from Bridgeport, they would call us niggas, and we're first cousins. So, yeah, it's deep in families. I know it's in ours. And that whole dark skin thing, it's everywhere. I didn't realize it till like 2 years ago. I saw 3 Asian people, professional people, talking about online. They had this video, and they were talking about Chinese and Japanese cultures, how it's a big thing to lighten your skin. The more you can seem and appear white, and this is their culture. I never knew that. And they talked about people who have surgery to open their eyes more because they're trying to look white. When I was on a radio station, the big star at the station, it was a major station. He was Italian. I was doing a show by myself one day. Commercial break, he comes in. Somebody was late, so he was bored out. He comes in, he goes, Bobby, I'm considered a nigger too with my people. And I said, you're the only nigga in this room. And he got a little nervous. And he goes, no, what I'm saying is I'm Sicilian. And to my people, we are considered the black people of our people. I had never heard that before until this Italian man told me that. Now, over the years, I've asked quite a few Italian people, including the insurance man yesterday, and they've all told me, no, it exists. No, it's true. And then I flipped to the sports world, probably the greatest coach of all time, Vince Lombardi. was Sicilian. And when I was reading David Moranis wrote a book about him, he thought Lombardi thought he would never get a head coaching job because he was Sicilian. He was a darker skinned Italian. So my point is, it's in a lot of folks, and it has to do with the color of the skin. It's sickening and it's a waste. It's I don't know. It's just deep. It's just deep. Talk about page 14. You had this quote you were talking about in 1988. Governor of Puerto Rico said, and I quote, "The contribution of the black race to Puerto Rican culture is irrelevant. Irrelevant. It's more rhetoric." Close quote. Like, what is this guy on? And this guy was the governor.
And unfortunately, that he wasn't an aberration, right?
No, because about 9 years later, or I'm sorry, 30 years later, another governor said almost the same thing. And I want you to talk about after you answered it, and that's about that Telegram Gate or something like that.
Mm-hmm. The thing with Telegram Gate was like, another one, Rosselló, gets caught with exchange of text messages with other politicos or what have you. And in those text messages, you see all this anti-Black sort of commentary, mentality, etc. Right? And, I think what's helpful about seeing that is it helps to better. People said to me, "Well, how do you explain that in Puerto Rico and in other parts of Latin America, etc., there's this celebration of Black music, of Afro dance, etc. Puerto Rico's the land of bomba y plena, which is very African. You can have these two things can coexist in the following way. It's about thinking of Blackness as having a proper place. And its proper place is in entertaining, cleaning for you, shaking your behind, singing, etc. Right? Meaning it has a very, very racialized place of contribution. But outside of that, right, it's derided. So meaning, unless you are there singing and dancing for me, being an entertainer, or cleaning my house or what have you, well, then you are not viewed as inherently having intellect or anything else that is worthy of being esteemed within our society. Right? So, I guess another way to put it, and I did put it this way in the book, is when it confuses people and looking at like, how do you have a love of Celia Cruz and also have all this anti-Blackness right within Latin America and the Caribbean? Well, it's like you can love Beyonce, etc., and you can still have all this anti-Black violence within our U.S. society. Right? These two things can coexist.
Right. Easily. Thank you for also writing about back in the day. There were a lot of Puerto Rican organizations in the 60s and 70s, like the Young Lords in New York, who modeled themselves after the Black Panthers. And nobody, all the television people all these years, nobody wants to speak to that. But I've seen a couple of shows on my own time detailing that. And it's a real powerful thing, but it's once again, if you don't write your own story, it won't get out. But there was more of working together as far as organizations in the 60s and 70s than what I feel I see today.
Well, another interesting thing about the example of the Young Lords is that Latinos will often reference the Young Lords to say, like, see, here was a group that worked across, race lines, etc. Right? But what they don't point out is that so many of those leaders within the Young Lords were Afro Puerto Ricans. Or Afro-Latinos. So I'm not trying to say that explains everything, but it certainly gives you a different kind of insight into why Young Lords as an entity would, one, think to emulate itself and have, be in fellowship with Black Panthers. Because as you said earlier in the broadcast, they got skin in the game. I mean, they understand they're both Black and Latino. And so it's not necessarily so foreign, right? This idea that Black Panthers would have something to say that would be worthwhile to listen to.
Yeah, when I was watching some of the videos, on the young. The first thing I picked up, without even hearing what they were saying or what was going on, I was like, them brothers got afros like they in the Jacksons. They look like they're in the Jackson family, you know? Oh, that was the first thing that hit me right away, visually. Relay the stories. We all know about Denny's, and Denny's has a problem with black folks. That's why they paid $54 million. But there was another interesting story that you talked about on page 38, where the manager threw out a group of black people because he said they didn't look right together, locked the door. But then when some Latino brothers came in, he unlocked the door and let them out. That manager had to be a white guy, right? He had to be a white guy, right?
So that was this was the case at a Denny's after the big lawsuit, right? So after the big lawsuit happens, Denny's is under sort of court order, like clean up their business, and they have a whole diversity plan. They have a whole how to train their managers, so it's like a new Denny's, right? But there's this white Latino in Miami who, when a group of correctional officers get off work, they go to the Denny's to go have dinner, right? So like something you would think like a normal everyday kind of event, right? Co-workers getting together and having a meal together. However, this group of COs or correctional officers were mixed, black and white, right? And the Latino manager, right, of the Denny's is the one who says, "Oh, you all don't look right together," and he's the one who has them saying like, "The kitchen is closed. We've run out of food." All these ridiculous things about like, "Oh, we're closing now," even though other people there in the restaurant eating. All right, and so when they leave, because they're correctional officers, they think to themselves, "Wait a second, something here ain't right." So they call the Denny's, right, and they say, "Oh, me and my friends want to come by. Is it too late? Can we still get in?" The person says on the phone, because he doesn't know who it is, right? "Oh, sure, we're open. Come on by." "Oh, the kitchen still has food." "Oh, yeah, some things we finished, but the full menu is pretty much available." So you got your perfect before and after case study there of discrimination, right? From this Latino who, despite Denny's having been, training everyone, decides, no, not in my town. I'm still going to operate the in-out Jim Crow kind of admission policy that would be prohibited anywhere else, right? But this idea of like Latino exceptionality, like, that, "Oh, this is not the same as white racism because I'm the one doing it as a Latino." Well, on its face, right, for those individuals who wanted to have a meal together as co-workers, there's no difference, right? It's the same kind of racism and racist exclusion, just despite it being more in Spanish.
Just what you were saying makes me think about the late great Dick Gregory, and he said he went into this place and the guy said, "We don't serve Negroes," and he said, "That's okay because I don't eat them." So, but anyway, I wanted to ask you this again because I think it's real key what goes on with judges and lawyers. And you said in that quote, "Latino jurors and judges themselves can be equally compounded by situations of Latino and black discrimination when they presume that Latino workplaces are not as susceptible to racial discrimination because of the predominance of Latin employees." Close quote. That takes it to another level that you didn't talk about before. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, what's interesting about the employment context is it's the place where you see the sort of the highest number of officially filed discrimination cases, unlike, housing or public accommodations, education, etc. And my suspicion is just because within the work context, that is foundational. You don't have the job, you can't pay for the food, you can't pay for the house, you can't. So it's so key that people will go through the discomfort of going through a lawsuit to deal with it. So, I point that out just to simply say that's why you have so much more evidence what goes on with cases within the employment context as opposed to other arenas for discrimination. And what is sort of very illuminating, shall we say, right, about the employment context is that when judges and juries or what have you are looking at the workplace and they're not, Latino, racially literate, let's put it that way, right? They'll see a workplace that's predominantly of Latinos, and in their minds, that's diverse. That's a diverse workplace.
What's the problem?
Right? So no problem. So meaning any kind of exclusion can't possibly be because of racism. It must be for some other reason. So much so that in cases where a Latino says there was anti-Black bias, they didn't want me. I'll give you an example. A Medgar Evers College study where it's an Afro-Latino, Afro-Panamanian, to be very particular, and he says there's a culture of favoritism of the white Hispanics in this office. I didn't get a fair shake. My contract wasn't renewed, unlike all these other bozos in the office, right? Despite my qualifications, because they preferred the white ones. Right? And the thing is, who's making the decisions in that department? It was a Spanish language department. Other Latinos. But for a racially illiterate judge and jury that thinks, oh, they're all Latinos, so that's diverse. So where there's diversity, there's no discrimination. A couple of leaps in logic there. They then are not readily able to properly analyze, right, and assess and ask for the right kind of evidence as to the probability, right, that there was discrimination going on there. Another aspect of the illiteracy too is that, just like in the U.S. and English, people talk in code, right? Sort of using racial proxies instead of using the N-word, but you can still kind of understand what the animosity there. It happens in Spanish as well. And the way it happens in Spanish is that people use countries as identifiers, and the countries are racially coded, meaning Dominican Republic means Black. Argentina means white. Mexico and Peru, that means indigenous people. Now, mind you, all those countries that I just named are actually multiracial and have people of all kinds of backgrounds. But the stereotypes about those locations within Latin American sort of rhetoric, right, is that they are racial identified. Right? And so to say, like an Argentinian means like a white European. And so when that language is used in the workplace to pigeonhole people about who should be where, right, and who has capacity and who doesn't, right, who's promising, who's not, etc., that language of coding, if you don't, again, not to beat a dead horse, but if you are racially illiterate, right, with regards to Latino racial attitudes, you will not get the connection.
Folks, listen, Racial Innocence. You need to get this book, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. You're hearing so much information today, but trust me. You all know that I bring the truth. There is so much more in this fantastic book. And yeah, it would be not only a great Christmas present, but it's something that your kids need to read also. Not just adults. Your kids need to read this. There's so much learning, so much information, so many things that are going to make them think, and there's so many things that are going to make them ask you questions that you shouldn't be afraid of. And if you don't know how to answer it, then email Professor Hernandez and she'll straighten your kids out. But anyway, I have to read this, Professor, because this is another powerful thing. Page 101, you said, and I quote, "It's just not skin color that penalize Latinos in the housing and rental market, but specifically Blackness. Neighborhoods demographically categorized as integrated can resemble worlds of strangers. This is because when Latinos choose to limit their interaction with Black neighbors to, what's that word there, fleeting contacts, racial stereotypes are left undisturbed, close quote. Preach, Professor Hernandez, preach. Woo! Oh my, I first read that, there were a couple of hairs on my neck with that attention. I said, this ain't no joke.
Well, what this goes to is the idea of, sometimes a space can look on the surface like, oh, but here are people from all different walks of life walking around. So isn't it okay here? Right? And what you can lose sight of is people can inhabit the same spaces. So like maybe something on a map is counted, right, by demographers as being an integrated space. But the way we live, though, right, we live block by block. Right? We don't live the whole zone. We live block by block. And block by block, things are not necessarily so integrated. Right? Church by church, school by school, store by store. That's how we live, right? We live within sort of the minutia, within the details. And then within those details, we can live very segregated lives. Right? So that just simply because in the zip code, you might have Latino surnames and people identified as African Americans on the census data forms. Right? That doesn't mean that the zip code is some racial paradise. Right? Closer analysis shows you, unfortunately, the way in which it's not a racial paradise, right? The way in which it is very much still part of a racial hierarchy and spaces of inclusion and exclusion.
I really wanted you to define this because I think some people get confused by it. You were talking about the cop with Sandra Bland, Brian and Senya, and you said that he was racially white but ethnically Latino. Explain to people who don't understand what that means.
Well, I think part of what complicates this for people, the separation between race and ethnicity, is that Blackness itself is often thought of as having no ethnicity, right? Meaning, the idea is like Blackness, that's African Americans. Then you say, what about the Blackness of actual people from Africa? Oh, well, yeah, okay, well, I guess they count as Black too, right? But it gets confusing for people because they have this idea of like Blackness only means African Americans, but here are folks who, from Francophone Africa who only speak in French and other tribal languages. They don't necessarily culturally have something in connection with people from Bridgeport, right? Who identify as Black, right? Meaning ethnically they are distinct, but racially they have something in common, right? Race is about how other people view you, right? And make assumptions about what your capabilities are or what your deficiencies are. Ethnicity, that's about the ways in which the food you're exposed to, the music you're exposed to, the dance that you're exposed to, many aspects of culture, right, have some distinction. So a Latino can, be Latino because of their ethnicity, right? They have a particular food, they speak a particular language, etc. But within ethnicity, there's racial differences. Just as like within ethnicity, there are racial differences. And so meaning Blackness comes in speaking French, speaking Dutch, speaking German, and lots of other languages, right? It has all kinds of different ethnic shades. But the racism of the United States has us all thinking that Blackness is just ethnically one thing. And so we don't understand, right, when it comes in other ethnic backgrounds. And so it also leads to confusion about Latinos, right, also being Black, and Latinidad is not itself being a race. Now, Latinos may, and unfortunately often, right, can experience discrimination based on their Latinidad, right? Meaning you hear the last name Hernandez, you don't have to see my face. Right?
Right, exactly.
Already Hernandez, if you will, is doing work, right? Meaning that a society can say, well, I don't want Hernandez in this particular job. I don't want a Hernandez living next door. You don't see me, but you have all these ideas. That's about discrimination against Latinos. Right? However, that coexists with the way in which a Hernandez can come darker and lighter. And that's an additional complication. It doesn't erase the first kind of discrimination, but it means it has its own form. a racial discrimination on top of the ethnic origin discrimination.
Wow. Before I get to the next question, before we go, is I had another Latino cop. We had this discussion, and he was telling me that he was white, Rodriguez, and I'm like, try to marry a Kennedy. You'll find out just how white you are. That's all. Real simple. Because you get followed in Walmart by security just like I do. And he thought it was funny, but there was, there's always truth with humor. There really is. Later on, you wrote this, and I noticed for a fact. You said, and I quote, many Afro-Latinos report that Latino police officers are harsher in their treatment of Latinos than non-Latino police officers are, close quote. Yeah, I not only would hear that occasionally from Latino people in the public, I heard it from a couple of Latino cops who knew they were Latino, who didn't play the other side of the fence, talking about other Latino officers and how they were mistreating Latinos because they, as cops, thought that they were white and they were mistreating their own people. I've heard that from Latino cops. I'm just giving you some insight into the police world. Yeah, it's there.
Well, I mean, one additional layer I'll add to it is that, the Latino law enforcement officer need not identify as white, right? They may not think of themselves as any kind of particular way. You know how that happens. Like some people are like, oh, I don't have a race. I'm just a human being. Okay, fine.
Yeah,
so you don't have a race. I got it. Right. However, they may harbor all the baggage of anti-Black racial attitudes, nevertheless. And so it's not so much that they're trying to act white, it's that they honestly believe, that there are good Black people and bad Black people. Right? And that for the most part, until proven otherwise, all Black people are the bad ones. And then those who kind of like somehow manage to like show you the dollar signs, that exist in their world, they then are able to then pull their way out of being the exception, right, and being the good Black. And that doesn't always have to deal with like them trying to act white. It's like this is how they think the world is aligned. And that's why it's a much bigger problem than just simply, how people racially identify themselves.
It's just such a deep thing. On page 125, on the political landscape, I want to switch up a little bit. Page 125, you said, and I quote, like working class non-Hispanics who vote against the wrong socioeconomic interests in pursuit of an association with the privilege of white racial identity. White identified Latinos can and have done the same, close quote. Speak to this because, as we know, in the 2016 presidential election, Trump got nearly 30% of the Latino vote. Polls now are saying he's getting 40% of the Latino vote. That just turns my stomach. But can you speak to that? Because this is the same guy who was throwing paper towels, in Puerto Rico when they had the storm, and he's throwing paper towels, smiling. I just don't understand how you just forget when you see the devil in front of you. You hear the devil, you see the devil's actions. How do you back this SOB? I just don't understand it.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about politics is how much people, well, I should say how much white people, can vote against their own self-interests because they're thinking only with racial status, right? Meaning that there's a very seductive power, right, that comes with this idea of being part of the esteemed group. Right? Meaning that if you view yourself as having something in common with, the Bill Gates of the world, rich white folk, that kind of makes you feel like a little bit better, right? Than what your factory job would otherwise enable you to aspire to. I mean, like, only thing between me and Bill is like, some opportunities, but if I work hard, I might get there, etc. Right? So that's not particular to Latinos, but it's, a larger problem. Within Latino communities, right, we have long had this very sort of like dichotomy between the promotion of the Latino vote, right, as being so consequential, as if it were coherently solid, meaning that you could gather all the Latino votes and you would get them all for like a particular candidate. And that's not true. Within the Latino electorate, right? Within the Latino electorate, you have great racial diversity, and with that racial diversity comes varying perspectives, right? About what a Trump has to offer versus other candidates, right? And so the what looks like schizophrenia, right, of having a Latino support a self-avowed white supremacist, shall we say? um, that comes from this idea of like, oh, because we hate the same people, or we both think that there is a problem with the way in which their benefits align to those who we view as not having, to being undeserving, etc. Right? There's a, how should we say, a way that politics has an electorate uh, voting more with aspiration than necessarily with what is more directly beneficial to them. This is what you can separate poor whites, right, from poor black people, right? If they voted with the self-interest, poor white people should get together and vote for the same people, right? The poor black people do, right? But they don't, right? And why don't they? Because they are, as W.E. Du Bois was saying, like, the wage of whiteness. They think that the payoff of identifying more with their whiteness and voting with, who rich white people vote for, and vote for the policies that rich white people vote for, that itself rubs off a little bit of the self-esteem, right? I may have a low wage job or no job at all, but I'm better than because of my whiteness.
Right. Yep. Man, it's your book, Racial Innocence. It's like a roller coaster ride. It brings you emotionally up and down, and I talked about the earlier question. I wanted people to know why you had skin in the game. And I talked to you and the audience about my father, who was a twin, and that whole situation. Speak to how your Puerto Rican mother was almost given away at a very early age. And I believe you had a grandmother who wasn't crazy about you leaving your hair out curly and things like that. Speak to those two things, please.
Well, my mother was always very clear with me, that she was black. That meant that I was black, that we were descendants of slaves. Like, it was always very clear for her, right? And people are often sort of surprised when I share that with them. They think, well, really? With all the pressure to like not identify as black, why would your mother do it? And why would she pass that on to you? Well, the thing is, unfortunately, like for so many black people, right? Trauma is what informs the clarity, right, about the significance of blackness, right? And so for my mother, her trauma happens very early. Right? Her father, African from Puerto Rico, and her mother, a lighter skin, try to act like it was all from the indigenous Taino ancestry, those folks who got killed off in the 1500s. But in any case, that's that, whole other kind of mindset. But the point is here that when my mom is born, she pops out and she looks, in the view of the family, too black. Everybody may be mixed, but they don't like when the mixture turns out too black. And so because my grandmother had come to the United States, had left the island, and lands in New York where her older sisters already are, her older sisters are like, okay, you got rid of that black man. You left him behind on the island. Now you with this kid. Let's get rid of this kid. Let's get her adopted with a black family. Those are my great aunt's view, right? Let's have this baby adopted by a black family, and so not with us. Not with us, because then she makes us look black, and we want to look black. So get this kid out of here. And so my mother knew about this, a story from her own infancy, because my grandmother repeated it over and over again. Whenever she got mad, I should have given you away. I should have had you go with that black family. I should put you in foster care right now. My grandmother didn't give her away, but at the same point, the trauma that she was inflicting, maybe it would have been better, like if she had let my mother be adopted, right, by an African American family who would have loved and welcomed her, as opposed to constantly subjecting her to the horrors of like, you are not welcome here because of the blackness, right? with that you are showing out with your, tightly coiled hair and your phenotype and your skin color, etc. Now, by the time I come along, my grandmother's mellowed like so many grandparents do. I also come out a little bit lighter, right? Hair a little bit straighter. And so she has less problem with that, me being the grandbaby. However, it's still not conflict free because, she still is who she is. And so, visiting with her meant having to hear from her, right? About hear her opinions, right? And her opinions were always very vocal about not wanting any curl to be showing, wanting it to be blow dried straight, not wanting too much time in the sun, because, otherwise I would look too dark. That's not good. So all these same attitudes are ones that are informing me, right? That, despite all this, oh, we're not like Americans, meaning North Americans, or, we're all mixed, we're so happy, blah, blah, blah. That, right there, not very much below the surface at all, right? Very much on the surface, right? It's all this anti-Blackness. And when you sort of see that, live it as part of your personal experience, it's much more, how should I put this? It is, you're not so distracted. You're not so distracted as a scholar, as an analyst of social dynamics by people's rhetoric, right, about being racially innocent or too mixed, too mestizo mulatto to harbor racism. You're not so distracted by any of that nonsense because you've seen the real deal up close and personal within your own family dynamics.
Boy, you bring me through so many personal things. I'm the same complexion as my mother, whose maiden name was Depina. My father was very light skinned, and when they got married, my father's mother didn't go to the wedding because my mother was too dark skinned. And once again, I heard this from my parents. They got married, again, a small ceremony, I don't know, a couple of years later, so that my father's mother now, she went. But yeah, she wouldn't go initially because my mother was dark skinned. And I'm sure there's family members of you that are very proud for the things that you write about and the power and the honesty that you bring. I'm very proud of you, and I'm just learning to know you better. There has to be some family members who ain't feeling some of the stuff you say, though. Is it possible?
Well, I think like it's so much that happens in families, there is that sort of willful blindness. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Things we'll talk about and things we won't talk about. Right? So the folks who are not like so enamored of what I have to say, those are things they don't want to talk about. Right? As far as family stuff is concerned, right? Like they like that, I'm writing books, but they don't want to talk about the details of the books.
Got it. All right. I understand that. Folks, as I stated earlier, you need to read this fantastic book, Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. It's a great present for you. It's a great family present. It's a great present for your kids. It's really important. It's a very important book. And you need to get it, folks. You need to get it. Whew, Professor Hernandez, you laid it down. You really did. And I can only hope that you enjoyed this interview half as much as I did, because your book is so important and so needed. Congratulations and thank you for your insight, your knowledge, and also your courage. So thank you very much, man.
Thank you, Bobby. It's so lovely to speak with you. And I've never, I think, had someone who had done such a close read of the book. And so that's an honor that,
It means a lot to me. So fantastic book. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Family, as always, I truly appreciate your support and thank you for your time this time until next time. I don't want to be a man of purpose, but I do want to be a man of power. Bobby. We did it again. You and Papa, what a team. I love you for life, my son.